Today we're going to talk about the biblical concept of turning the other cheek. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a long time because over the years I've gotten many questions about this. Maybe this area gets questioned as much or just as much as almost anything else. It's something people really want to know about. And the question comes down to, is Jesus' command to us to turn the other cheek a general command for pacifism? Does that mean there is never a time when we should defend ourselves? Or was Jesus' command meant to be observed during specific situations for certain reasons? And if so, what are those situations? What are the limitations of when we are supposed to turn the other cheek versus when we are not supposed to, or when we do not have to do that? Well, let's start with the scripture that brings about this conversation, and then we'll work through the implications. Now, this appears in Luke. We should have read through this during our Bible in a Year challenge, but I'm going to read the account from Matthew because it has some of the specifics in Matthew that aren't in Luke that are going to help drive where we go with this. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42 says this: "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." So some people have read through these words from Jesus, especially where he says, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person." They have read these words and they have taken this to mean that Jesus is calling for all of us to be pacifists. They would say that a Christian has no right to commit an act of violence at all. We should never, under any circumstance, resist an evil person. And I think this particular interpretation of Matthew chapter 5 and the parallel passages elsewhere comes from maybe a misunderstanding from the King James translation. I can't prove this, but I'm guessing maybe this has something to do with it. In King James, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, when it's working through the 10 Commandments, the King James has this one: "Thou shalt not kill." And so people who are linking up Jesus' words with pacifism can find this Old Testament command here that we should not kill, and they would take this to mean we should never kill under any circumstances. This is one of the 10 Commandments. But of course, most of us are familiar with this translation and know that maybe that made sense to the original readers in 1611, but for our modern ears in the 21st century, one of the other English translations may be a little bit more accurate, that say instead of "thou shalt not kill," it says "you shall not murder." And we can have confidence that the 10 Commandments is not talking about general killing, but talking about murder, because the Old Testament is absolutely packed full of examples of people who kill in a righteous manner, many times at the command of God himself. If any type of killing was sinful and prohibited, then many of these other stories in the Old Testament just wouldn't make sense. So because of this precedent, we have to accept the translation of "thou shalt not murder," not "thou shalt not kill." So obviously some type of killing in the Old Testament, there's a precedent that it's allowable. So given these teachings then, everything we read in the Old Testament, can Jesus really be advocating for pacifism? Is it wrong to kill under any circumstance? Are there not times when it is okay to defend ourselves or to resist an evil person? Sometimes a lack of resistance is the right thing to do, but as we see in the Old Testament, sometimes man has actually honored God by not resisting an evil act and by fighting back. As Solomon said back in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time for war and a time for peace." Now, some people have looked at this situation and said, well, what we're really seeing here, given the things that I've brought up, they would say what we're seeing is a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Under the Old Covenant, that sort of killing was allowed, but now Jesus has come along and said, we can't do that anymore. Well, okay, I guess I get the argument, but it really doesn't hold together too well for a couple of different reasons. One, although some things do change in the new covenant from where they were in the old covenant, nothing really does a 180. Nothing that was good before becomes evil. Nothing that was evil becomes good. Jesus didn't abolish the law. He came to complete the law. So it would seem weird that something as foundational as killing another human being could have honored God in the Old Testament times, but now would be repulsive in his sight in the New Testament times. So I'd be a little hesitant to accept that argument based on logic alone. But we also have some other scripture in the New Testament that we can point to see that indeed, under some circumstances, killing is okay with God as a thing to do. In the New Testament, Paul tells us that God has given government the authority to use the sword, and that means to kill. Romans chapter 13, verse 4, "For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." So this passage here absolutely conflicts with our interpretation of pacifism. If God authorized the use of the sword to the government, that's clearly not a call for pacifism. That's exactly the opposite. That's all about correcting or stopping the evil acts of another person. Now, I hope you're with me on this so far, but I understand there still may be some holdouts. There still may be some folks who believe that Jesus has called for pacifism in every single circumstance. And so for those folks, we'll go ahead and go one step further and look at another biblical precedent here and hopefully put these final concerns to rest. The final logical argument that I think still exists here is that some people have made the distinction and said, yes, God has given the government the sword, but that's for the government, that's not for us. And a true Christian would never have anything to do with such matters. Those are matters to be left to the pagan government and let them take care of business, while a true Christian would stay removed from these things and remain a pacifist. Well, to address that, we could look at a couple of different things or say a couple of different things. First of all, we've got to note the Bible does not come out and say that. And that's a specific enough thing that I would believe that if that's what God had wanted us to do, that would have been spelled out for us. And the Bible really doesn't spell that out. But just in case that really is the implication here, then we can look at one more biblical precedent here and hopefully put our arguments to bed here once and for all. Let's talk about John chapter 18, verses 10 through 11, and this is when Jesus is being arrested. It says, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, 'Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?'" Now, we can get a lot of insight into our dilemma here by looking at the specifics of this part of the account of Jesus being arrested. These details are important, and specifically here we have to understand and come to terms with the fact that Peter had a sword. Peter was carrying a sword around with him, and we think about what a sword is, and what a sword isn't. We've got to recognize a sword is not good for a whole lot of things other than combat. Right? A sword is not used for hunting. A sword is not used for farming. It's not a tool that there's other uses for where it can also be a weapon. It's not like a bow and arrow. That can be a good hunting implement that you could also use as a weapon or perhaps misuse as a weapon instead. It's not like a hammer, which is something that can be used for crafting, but also used or misused as a weapon. A sword is good for one thing and one thing only, and that's combat. Peter was carrying a sword. Now, in all fairness, when he pulled it out and struck someone with it, Jesus told him to put it away. But notice what Jesus did not say in this encounter. Jesus said, "Put your sword away." He didn't say, "Peter, why are you carrying a sword?" He didn't say, "Peter, get rid of that sword. I never want to see it again." He didn't say, "Peter, it is wrong for you to have a sword." There's a whole lot of other things that Jesus didn't say here. He said, "Put away your sword." And so by saying that, Peter put his sword away. It would have been available for use at a later time. So in his rebuke, I think it's pretty clear that Jesus didn't seem to be condemning all possible armed resistance, because otherwise, why would Peter have a sword with him? Jesus was simply condemning the use of the sword in this particular instance. Violence is usually not the answer, but the fact of the matter is, sometimes violence is the answer. So again, think of Solomon's words in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There is a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. So I think we can take Jesus' turn the other cheek comment as something other than a general call for pacifism. There is a season to resist evil and there is a season not to. And here I believe Jesus was simply trying to teach us an important lesson to apply when it is a season not to resist. So to understand the different seasons here, we first have to recognize that there is a difference foundationally between meekness and weakness. We have to understand that, but these two concepts are often confused. There is a difference between these words, meekness and weakness, but especially when we apply them to not resisting evil. Here's how that works. If we are weak, then we can't stop someone from doing evil to us, and so why even bother to try? We should just let it happen. We are too weak to confront that evil. But if we are meek instead of weak, it's a different story entirely. Maybe we are capable of stopping that evil act from happening, but we elect not to. It is our choice. And the results might be the same, the evil act still takes place, but these are two completely different transactions that have happened, and we have to recognize that. Also, we have to recognize this is just the setup to the second part of what Jesus was telling us, and this is the part that we often miss when we work through these passages. There is a second part about this that we absolutely cannot miss. Jesus says, don't stop at not resisting. Jesus said, after you resist, you need to take it to the next level. In the instance where we've been struck, that means Jesus said, turn the other cheek and allow yourself to be struck again. Or in the case where someone is going to sue you to take an article of your clothing, allow that to happen, but then once that's done, offer up an even more valuable article of clothing for them to have as well. Or the third option was if someone forces you to carry their burden for a mile, once that's done, ask them if they would be interested in you carrying it for another mile as well. And in doing that, when you take it to the next level like that, after submitting to the original evil intent, understand what's happening. We've got to take notice of this. The entire paradigm of the transaction changes. We had something forced on us. There was this evil act that was forced upon us, and that's being struck or being sued or maybe being forced into labor. And so there was the submission first to that evil thing, absolutely. But when we take the action to do the next step, we are assuming control over the situation. And this makes all the difference. After we've carried the other person's burden that first mile, we've not resisted that initial evil thing that they try to do to us, yes, but by offering to go the extra mile, we now put ourselves in the driver's seat of this situation. And we have changed the opportunity from simply submitting to an evil situation to one where we show that person grace. So let's think about that. Someone doing evil and then being shown grace. What does that remind you of? Well, exactly. We're modeling godly behavior here through doing these things. We're teaching a very simple gospel message through our actions, and it is a very powerful message indeed. And so I think our original position works here when Jesus says not to resist an evil person, and he gives us these three examples. Notice these are all examples where we can turn the table and show grace, and that means we have to survive the initial encounter. Jesus' lesson doesn't really work here if we're confronted with someone who intends to murder us. If we don't resist someone's evil intentions to kill us, we won't live to be able to show them grace. We can't live to carry out the rest of Jesus' advice in this case. So I don't think physical survival situations were what Jesus had in mind when he told us not to resist an evil person. So now this lesson seems a lot easier to apply. We just first have to add a test before we decide what we're going to do. If someone wants to do evil to you, We have to first ask the question, are we likely to survive that encounter? And if yes, then it seems that we should let that evil thing happen because it gives us an opportunity to show that evil person grace. We can show them some of the same love that God has shown to us. But if we do assess the situation and we think we are unlikely to survive the ordeal, then we have to remember we've been given the Second Amendment for a reason. Use it. There is absolutely nothing biblically wrong with doing that. And yes, we may be oversimplifying the situation here. Maybe rape and a handful of other things could also justify deadly force. That's a discussion for another day. I think you get my main point here. Jesus' words to turn the other cheek are indeed words to live by, but in applying them, we have to remember there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. I hope that's been helpful. I hope it's been interesting. And until next time, Lord willing, there is a next time. May God bless you and your family.